Tonight, something extraordinary has happened on the global stage. The world watched stunned as two of Vladimir Putin's closest allies, China and Turkey, quietly stepped back from the shadow of the Kremlin. And just as Moscow plunged literally into darkness after Ukraine's precision strikes crippled its power grid, Putin's empire began to flicker like a dying candle in the wind. When the world talks about isolation, it often means sanctions, political statements, or broken diplomatic ties. But what we are witnessing right now with Russia is far deeper, far more significant. It's the strategic isolation of a superpower that once believed it could rewrite the global order. And the most telling part? It's not Washington or Brussels leading this isolation. It's Beijing and Ankara, two capitals that once played the role of quiet enablers, now stepping back in calculated silence. That silence tonight is louder than any missile blast. For years, Vladimir Putin built his global influence on the foundation of relationships with nations like China and Turkey. These weren't just friendships, they were strategic lifelines. China provided the economic oxygen Russia needed, buying oil, investing in infrastructure, and shielding Moscow from total Western isolation. Turkey acted as a geopolitical bridge, balancing its NATO membership with deep economic and energy cooperation with Russia. Together, they formed the illusion that no matter how far Russia went in Ukraine, it would always have two major powers in its corner. That illusion just collapsed. So what happened? The first cracks appeared quietly. A few delayed shipments, subtle diplomatic hesitations, muted responses from Beijing on Russia's latest military failures. Then came the signals that couldn't be ignored. China began reviewing its energy deals, citing market instability. Turkey announced an indefinite hold on defense collaboration. And behind closed doors, Turkish officials reportedly began re-engaging with NATO defense planners. These aren't small moves. These are seismic tremors in the global political landscape. Beijing's decision to step back is pure realpolitik. China doesn't move emotionally, it moves strategically. And when China distances itself, it's never random. It's calculated, cold, and deliberate. The Chinese leadership has realized that Putin's war has become a bottomless pit, draining resources, igniting sanctions, and dragging anyone too close into the economic mud. For China, that's a dangerous game. Its global ambitions depend on stability, trade, and predictability. Aligning too closely with a collapsing regime threatens all of that. Turkey, on the other hand, plays a different game, one of leverage. President Erdogan thrives in chaos. He maneuvers between East and West like a seasoned chess player. For months, he used his relationship with Putin to extract concessions from NATO and the European Union. But now, as the Russian economy falters and Moscow's military prestige erodes, Erdogan sees no more advantage in standing beside a losing hand. He's shifting gears, pivoting back toward the West, reasserting Turkey's importance as a regional power broker, not a Russian sidekick. Here's the hook. Both nations didn't abandon Putin because they suddenly found moral clarity. They abandoned him because they found better options. Power doesn't wait for loyalty. It follows momentum. And right now, momentum is on Ukraine's side. This new wave of isolation cuts deeper than sanctions. It pierces the very architecture of Russia's foreign policy. When your friends, not your enemies, start doubting your stability, that's when you know the empire is cracking from within. The optics alone are devastating. China, the global powerhouse, Putin, once boasted of partnering with, quietly stepping away. Turkey, the NATO member who defied the West to buy Russian weapons, freezing military cooperation. That's not isolation by punishment, that's isolation by irrelevance. And make no mistake, Moscow feels it. Kremlin insiders are reportedly scrambling to downplay these developments, framing them as temporary diplomatic recalibrations. But that's spin, and the world knows it. Every time a shipment gets delayed, every time a defense deal stalls, every time a friendly leader stops returning phone calls, Putin's aura of control fades a little more. What makes this moment so powerful is that it exposes the truth. Putin has spent 2 decades hiding that his so-called alliances were never built on respect, only mutual convenience. The second that convenience disappeared, so did the loyalty. And now, Russia stands alone, militarily stretched, economically strangled, and diplomatically ghosted. So as Ukraine's drones strike deeper and Moscow's lights flicker, the symbolism couldn't be clearer. The Darkness isn't just physical, it's political. The world's major players have looked at Russia, measured the cost of standing beside it, and decided it's no longer worth the price. That's not just isolation, that's abandonment. And for a man who built his image on global dominance, being abandoned by your closest allies might just be the most humiliating defeat of all. When history looks back at this war, it won't just remember Ukraine's courage, it will remember its brilliance. Because what Ukraine is doing right now goes beyond bravery. It's tactical evolution in real time, a smaller nation rewriting the playbook on how to fight, adapt, and win against a seemingly superior force. And the moment that sent shockwaves through every military command center in the world was when Ukraine plunged Moscow into darkness. Not with massive air raids, but with precision, strategy, and psychological mastery. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Every drone strike, every cyber disruption, every intelligence leak, all of it aligned to dismantle not just Russia's infrastructure, but its confidence. And that's where Ukraine's true power lies. The Kremlin built its empire on fear, the image of an unstoppable army, an unbreakable leader, an unshakable system. But Ukraine, through skill and resolve, is turning that image into rubble piece by calculated piece. Let's start with the operation that silenced Moscow's skyline. Ukrainian drones, small, agile, and ingeniously modified, penetrated deep into Russian airspace, bypassing one of the most heavily guarded defense networks in the world. These weren't random hits. They targeted substations, transmission nodes, and data control centers, the invisible arteries that keep Moscow alive. Within hours, entire districts went dark. The lights in Red Square flickered. The Kremlin itself reportedly had to rely on emergency generators. The symbolism was stunning. The capital of an empire humiliated by technology no bigger than a kitchen table. And that's the hook. This wasn't about destruction. It was about demonstration. Ukraine wanted to prove that modern warfare isn't about size. It's about precision. It's about intelligence, timing, and psychological impact. By showing that it could touch Moscow, Ukraine didn't just score a tactical victory, it shattered the myth that Russia's homeland was untouchable. For Putin, that's a nightmare far worse than losing a battlefield. It means the war has come home. Behind this operation lies a new kind of warfare, a hybrid blend of digital intelligence, AI-driven target coordination, and human resilience. Ukrainian strategists are now using real-time satellite imagery, predictive algorithms, and data from Western surveillance systems to coordinate strikes that are smarter, faster, and more cost-effective than Russia's brute force tactics. Every dollar Ukraine spends delivers 10 times the psychological impact of what Russia achieves with entire missile barrages. That's not coincidence, that's genius. And consider the timing. Ukraine didn't strike during the day, when Moscow could spin it as a technical glitch or downplay the impact. No, the blackout came at night, when images of darkened city blocks flooded social media. Civilians lit candles, car lights lined the streets, and the Kremlin's usual propaganda channels went silent. That silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic, because in the information age, perception is power. And for a few haunting hours, the world saw a vulnerable Russia, stripped of its swagger, cloaked in literal and political darkness. This is what makes Ukraine's tactical approach revolutionary. It's not fighting for spectacle, it's fighting for psychology. Every move is designed to expose the cracks in Putin's facade, to make his people question, his allies hesitate, and his enemies believe. And it's working. Russian military bloggers are openly admitting their defense systems are overwhelmed. Ordinary citizens are questioning the billions spent on security when even Moscow can't keep its lights on. But what truly separates Ukraine's tactics from traditional warfare is its asymmetry of intent. Ukraine isn't trying to conquer, it's trying to survive, and that changes everything. Survival breeds innovation. When your nation's future depends on every decision, you think differently, you fight smarter, you adapt faster. That's why Ukraine's defense forces have become one of the most creative and effective modern militaries in the world. They're not just fighting back, they're reinventing resistance. And here's where the psychological warfare reaches its peak. Every blackout in Moscow doesn't just disrupt infrastructure, it erodes Putin's myth of control. For decades, the Kremlin's greatest weapon was predictability. The idea that the state was always one step ahead. Now, Ukraine has flipped that script. Moscow no longer knows what's coming, when it's coming, or how to stop it. That uncertainty breeds fear, and fear breeds mistakes. So when the lights go out in the heart of Russia, they illuminate something far more powerful: Ukraine's rise as a tactical and technological giant. A country once underestimated, dismissed as fragile, now dictates the rhythm of a global confrontation. That's not just dominance on the battlefield, that's dominance in narrative, in psychology, and in the future of warfare itself. For 2 decades, Vladimir Putin built his empire on a single, carefully engineered illusion, the illusion of control. He was the man who never blinked, the leader who always had a plan, the strong man whose grip on Russia seemed unbreakable. His power wasn't just political, it was psychological. It was crafted through fear, choreographed through propaganda, and reinforced through every image of him riding horses, commanding armies, and lecturing the West. But tonight, that image is collapsing. The world is watching the slow, visible disintegration of the Putin narrative. And the irony is, it's happening not from outside pressure, but from within the very myth he created. Here's the hook. Putin didn't just lose ground in Ukraine. He's losing the story that made him invincible. Because power in its purest form isn't about weapons or wealth. It's about belief. The Russian people believed in his stability. His allies believed in his strategy. His enemies believed in his ruthlessness. That belief was his armor, and Ukraine has found the crack. The war has exposed something the Kremlin could never afford to admit. Putin's strength was never absolute. It was always borrowed from fear, borrowed from oil money, borrowed from a system too scared to challenge him. But now, fear is fading, money is drying up, and loyalty is starting to fracture. And the moment a strong man looks weak, the entire architecture of authoritarianism begins to tremble. Inside Russia, you can already feel the tremors. Local governors are quietly distancing themselves from the Kremlin. Business elites are moving assets out of the country. Soldiers at the front lines are refusing orders, their morale shattered by endless defeats. The machinery of control, that intricate web of obedience that once defined Putin's rule, is rusting in real time. And every blackout in Moscow, every Ukrainian strike, every Western sanction acts like a hammer hitting that rusted armor. But perhaps the most fascinating unraveling is psychological. For years, Putin's image thrived on the promise of order. He was the man who ended the chaos of the 1,990 seconds, who brought back pride, who made Russia great again. That promise is gone. Moscow's citizens are now facing blackouts, inflation, and international humiliation, all under the watch of the man who claimed he could protect them from exactly that. The contrast between propaganda and reality has never been sharper. And here's the irony that history will not forget. The man who sold stability has delivered chaos. The leader who demanded loyalty is now being quietly abandoned. The strategist who claimed to outsmart the West is now outmaneuvered by a country he thought would fall in 3 days. It's not just a military failure, it's a narrative collapse. And for a regime built entirely on image, that's lethal. Propaganda can only hold as long as people want to believe it. Once they stop, it turns hollow. Russian state television still airs fiery speeches about victory, but behind the camera, the cracks are widening. Officials whisper about replacements, oligarchs fund exit strategies, and ordinary citizens scroll through VPNs, searching for truth beyond the lies. It's no longer about whether Putin wins or loses the war. It's about whether his people still believe he can lead them anywhere at all. Even his allies sense the shift. When China and Turkey start pulling away, it's not just geopolitics, it's a signal that Putin's credibility as a global power broker is fading. They see what his own circle sees, a man surrounded by yes-men, trapped in his own mythology, unable to adapt to a world that's moved on from fear-based politics. The isolation isn't just diplomatic, it's existential, and that's the hook. Putin's greatest enemy was never Ukraine or NATO, it was reality. Reality doesn't bend to propaganda forever. Eventually, the truth seeps through the cracks, through the blackouts, through the losses, through the silence of allies who no longer call. And now, the truth is catching up. The image of Putin as the untouchable czar, the master strategist, the eternal strongman, it's dissolving before our eyes. What remains is something far smaller, far weaker, a man cornered by his own myth, surrounded by fear, and haunted by the empire he thought he controlled. The collapse isn't coming. It's already here, not with explosions, but with disbelief. Because once a nation stops believing in the storyteller's power is gone. When China makes a move, the world feels it. Beijing doesn't act impulsively. It calculates, measures, and projects decades ahead, like a chess grandmaster studying every line before making a single move. So when China begins to quietly pull back from Vladimir Putin, it isn't just a diplomatic shift. It's a warning shot to the entire global order. Something fundamental has changed, and Beijing has decided that the Kremlin is no longer an asset, but a liability. The silence from Beijing tonight speaks volumes. And in international politics, silence often screams louder than words. For years, China and Russia projected an image of unbreakable partnership, two powerful autocracies pushing back against what they called Western domination. They signed energy deals, held joint military drills, and crafted a narrative of a new multipolar world. Putin called it a no-limits friendship. But the truth is, there are always limits, and Beijing just drew them. Because for all of Putin's bravado, China's loyalty has always been transactional, not emotional. The relationship was never built on trust, but on utility. And as the war in Ukraine drags on, that utility is evaporating. The hook here is simple but striking. China doesn't bet on losers. It never has. It studies patterns, analyzes risks, and adjusts before disaster strikes. What we're seeing now is a pivot born not of morality, but of pragmatism. Beijing has realized that standing too close to Putin's collapsing war machine threatens its own global ambitions. China's power depends on stability, on trade, manufacturing, predictable markets, and a carefully managed international reputation. And Putin's chaos threatens every one of those. Inside Beijing's strategy circles, the conversation has shifted. The tone that once framed Russia as a strategic ally has become cautious, even skeptical. Energy contracts are being reviewed, joint projects are delayed, state media has toned down its once fiery pro-Russian coverage. These subtle shifts may seem small, but in the world of Chinese diplomacy, they're seismic. When Beijing stops amplifying your message, it's the first sign that you're being phased out. Putin misread China's intentions from the start. He saw a partner in rebellion, another power willing to stand shoulder to shoulder against the West. But what he failed to grasp is that China doesn't join rebellions, it manages them. Beijing isn't in the business of burning bridges. It's in the business of building empires quietly while others destroy theirs. As Russia burns through its economy, its credibility, and its manpower, China watches, learns, and steps back just far, enough to avoid the fallout. Economically, the stakes for China are immense. Its trade with Europe dwarfs its trade with Russia. Every new sanction against Moscow ripples outward, threatening to disrupt the global supply chains that keep China's factories running. Supporting Putin too openly risks secondary sanctions, investor panic, and a diplomatic backlash that Beijing cannot afford. So the pivot isn't ideological, it's protective self-interest. The Chinese leadership knows that in geopolitics, proximity to failure is dangerous. And right now, Putin represents failure. But here's the deeper layer. This move is not just about economics, it's about narrative control. China's leadership thrives on projecting competence, order, and long-term vision. Associating with a regime that's increasingly viewed as unstable, reckless, and desperate undermines that image. Every blackout in Moscow, every battlefield loss in Ukraine, every defection of a Russian ally paints Putin as yesterday's man, and Beijing doesn't stand beside yesterday's men. There's also a symbolic humiliation for the Kremlin buried in all this. When Russia's foreign ministry reached out for new talks on expanding trade agreements, Beijing's response was described by insiders as non-committal. Non-committal, that's diplomacy's way of saying you're on your own. And that's devastating for a regime that's built its identity on projecting strength through alliances. Putin now finds himself shouting into a void that once echoed back with Chinese support, but no more. The hook, and it's a sharp one, is that China's retreat is not loud, it's surgical. It doesn't announce breakups. It performs political amputations in silence. By the time the Kremlin fully realizes what's happening, the financial arteries will already be severed, The diplomatic channels cooled and the trust long gone. Beijing will move forward, reshaping its global strategy, while Moscow is left trying to understand how its no-limits partner disappeared into the mist. In truth, this moment exposes what many analysts have long suspected. Russia was never China's equal. It was a pawn, a useful distraction, a shield, a pressure valve against the West. But pawns are expendable. When the board changes, the Grand Master sacrifices them without hesitation. And in this global game, Beijing has just decided that Putin's Russia no longer deserves protection. It deserves distance. When it comes to political maneuvering, few leaders play the global chessboard as skillfully as Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He has always understood one fundamental truth of power. Alliances are not sacred. They are strategic tools. For years, Erdogan balanced on the razor's edge between East and West, between NATO and Moscow, extracting leverage from both. But now that balance is shifting decisively. Turkey is pivoting away from Putin's orbit, and the quiet recalibration happening in Ankara could reshape the dynamics of this entire war. Because when Erdogan moves, it's never by accident, it's by design. The hook here is sharp. Erdogan isn't abandoning Putin because of pressure. He's doing it because he smells opportunity. In the world of geopolitics, timing is everything. And Erdogan's timing has always been surgical. For 2 years, he used his relationship with Russia to position Turkey as the indispensable middleman, the only nation that could talk to both sides, broker grain deals, mediate prisoner exchanges, and still buy cheap Russian gas. But that balancing act only works when both sides are strong. And right now, Putin is no longer strong. Turkey sees the same cracks that the rest of the world sees. A Russian military struggling to maintain momentum, an economy collapsing under sanctions, and an image of power dissolving into desperation. For Erdogan, the calculation is simple. Proximity to a faltering power brings risk, not reward. So the pivot begins quietly, carefully, but unmistakably. Turkish defense contracts with Russia are suddenly under review. Energy deals are being renegotiated. High-level talks between Ankara and Kyiv have resumed with new urgency. It's not loud, but it's strategic, a signal to the West that Turkey is ready to realign itself when the conditions are right. Erdogan's genius has always been his ability to transform volatility into bargaining power. Every crisis, every conflict, every diplomatic standoff becomes a stage for him to increase Turkey's leverage. Now, as Russia falters, Erdogan is seizing the moment to reassert Turkey's role as the power broker of the region, the gatekeeper of NATO's southern flank, the bridge between Europe and Asia, the nation that can talk to everyone when no one else can. And in this moment of shifting alliances, that kind of flexibility isn't just valuable, it's essential. Behind the scenes, Ankara is already positioning itself for the post-Putin era. Turkish intelligence has increased coordination with Western counterparts, especially on Black Sea security and energy corridors. Turkish companies, once reliant on Russian markets, are reestablishing supply chains with Europe. Even Turkish state media, long a mirror for Erdogan's messaging, has begun softening its coverage of Moscow while amplifying stories of Ukrainian resilience. These are not coincidences. They are indicators of a strategic migration. Turkey slowly walking away from the shadow of the Kremlin and back toward the Western camp. And here's where the hook tightens. This pivot isn't about ideology. It's about survival and supremacy. Erdogan knows that Turkey's long-term interests lie in being indispensable to both the West and the East, but never dependent on either. With Russia now weakened and unpredictable, Ankara sees a chance to reclaim moral high ground and political leverage simultaneously. By aligning more visibly with Ukraine and NATO at this critical juncture, Turkey can reshape the narrative not as a latecomer, but as a decisive player in turning the tide against Russian aggression. Putin, of course, sees the betrayal coming. He's a man who prizes loyalty above all else, and Erdogan's quiet withdrawal cuts deep. The two once shared a transactional understanding, a mutual tolerance built on energy, arms, and anti-Western sentiment. But trust was never part of that equation. Their relationship was always a temporary alliance between two strongmen, each using the other to extend influence. Now, as Moscow grows desperate, Erdogan is doing what Putin never could, adapting. Every signal from Ankara is calibrated to maximize benefit and minimize risk. When Turkey allowed Sweden to advance toward NATO membership after months of resistance, it wasn't just a diplomatic concession, it was a strategic message. One that said, we're back in the Western fold when it suits us. When Turkish officials speak about energy independence and new defense collaborations with European firms, they're not just talking economics. They're announcing a quiet but deliberate return to balance, one where Russia no longer anchors Turkey's foreign policy. And that's what makes this pivot so devastating for the Kremlin. Erdogan isn't defecting with noise or condemnation. He's walking away with precision, step by calculated step, leaving Putin stranded in the very isolation he once inflicted on others. The geopolitical winds are changing, and Turkey, ever the opportunist, has already turned its sails. The story here isn't just about a diplomatic shift. It's about Erdogan's instinct for survival and supremacy in a world that rewards flexibility over loyalty. While Putin clings to fading narratives of strength, Erdogan is writing a new one where Turkey emerges from the shadows of Russia's collapse, not weakened, but empowered. And that, more than any drone strike or sanction, is what truly terrifies the Kremlin tonight. The night Moscow went dark was not just a blackout. It was a message written in the language of power, a visual metaphor that broadcast a truth Vladimir Putin has spent decades concealing. His empire is vulnerable. The streets of the Russian capital, usually blazing with the lights of a city asserting dominance, were suddenly empty, illuminated only by the faint glow of emergency generators and scattered car headlights. For a regime that thrives on the projection of strength, the symbolism could not have been more damning. It was as if the very heart of Russia was confessing its fragility and the world was watching. The hook here is undeniable. When lights go out in a capital, it doesn't just disrupt infrastructure, it disrupts perception. Moscow has long been the backdrop for Putin's image of control, the stage upon which the narrative of invincibility was performed. Every illuminated street, every grand square, every Kremlin tower in the night sky reinforced the illusion that Russia was stable, capable, and unchallenged. But as drones struck, transmission nodes failed, and entire districts slipped into darkness, that illusion shattered in an instant. What remained was vulnerability laid bare, a visual testament to the fact that even the most formidable empires are built on precarious systems. The psychological impact of this event cannot be overstated. In authoritarian regimes, perception often outweighs reality. Citizens internalize the signals of control, and international observers take their cues from the symbols of order. When those signals falter, when the very lights that define normalcy are extinguished, it sends ripples far beyond the immediate area affected. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt begin to seep into the collective consciousness. People start to question whether their leaders can truly protect them. Allies start to reconsider commitments. Enemies see opportunity. That is precisely what Ukraine achieved with precision and timing. But this darkness was more than just a strategic strike. It was performative power in reverse. Ukraine knew that hitting the infrastructure of Moscow wouldn't just cripple energy grids. It would fracture the psychological framework that supports Putin's authority. The blacked-out city became a canvas on which the narrative of Russian fragility was painted. Social media exploded with images and videos of empty streets, powerless trams, and flickering traffic lights, a visual counterpoint to Kremlin propaganda. For hours, the symbol of Russia's strength was reduced to shadows and silhouettes, and in those shadows, a story of weakness unfolded. The irony is striking. The Kremlin has spent years perfecting the art of information control, crafting a narrative that the world outside could not challenge. Yet, in a single night, technology and strategy turned the tables. A network of drones, intelligence, coordination, and tactical planning exposed the limitations of Russian infrastructure and highlighted the overconfidence of its leadership. What Putin projected as omnipotence was revealed as brittle, susceptible to disruption, and entirely dependent on systems that could be compromised. There's also a metaphorical resonance that cannot be ignored. Darkness has long represented both danger and clarity, threat and truth. By plunging Moscow into literal darkness, Ukraine illuminated a deeper reality. Russia's vulnerabilities are not hidden, they are systemic. The blackout reflected not just a failure of wires and substations, but a failure of leadership, planning, and strategic foresight. It demonstrated that even the most carefully curated image of power can be undone by small, precise, and intelligent actions. The human dimension adds another layer of significance. Citizens, once reassured by the constant glow of their city, were confronted with the fragility of daily life. Businesses stopped, communications faltered, and the omnipresent sense of security was suspended. That disruption, brief though it may have been, resonates far deeper than any battlefield loss. It erodes confidence, generates anxiety, and chips away at the obedience that authoritarian regimes rely upon. Every blackout is a signal, and every signal carries a lesson. Moscow's darkness was a declaration. Russia is not untouchable. It is not immune to disruption. It is not invincible. The visual, symbolic, and psychological impact of this event reverberates across the globe, reminding allies and adversaries alike that the balance of power is not fixed, that even capitals can falter, and that strategic brilliance can expose the cracks in the mightiest of empires. So tonight, as Moscow sits in the dark and the world reconfigures its alliances, remember this moment, because history will look back and say, this was the turning point. When China and Turkey walked away, the illusion of Putin's invincibility died. And while the lights may be out in Moscow, the light of freedom burning fiercely in Kyiv and across Ukraine has never shone brighter. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned, because this story is far from over.